There are places where night falls quickly, as though someone has closed a door. The western fjords are not such places. Here the sun lingers stubbornly, dragging the day into evening and evening into something that only pretends to be night. Shadows stretch, gulls complain, and the water glows long after everyone wishes it would stop. The harbor beneath this sky does not rest. It creaks and groans, shouts and bargains, smells of tar and onions and fish that should have been eaten yesterday. Men claim their goods are priceless. Women sigh that they are not. Children run until they collapse, and animals wander through it all as though appointed judges. Nothing remarkable happens, and yet everything does. This is not the story of heroes, nor of battles, nor of kings. It is the story of a single day stretched thin, filled with clumsy work, endless haggling, and the kind of accidents that make neighbors laugh for years. If one listens closely, it might even be history. Or perhaps it is only noise. Either way, the harbor carries on. The harbor never truly slept, but at dawn it gave the best impression of trying. The tide shifted lazily, slapping against the piers in a rhythm that was neither hurried nor deliberate, just the same pattern it had kept for centuries. Fog rolled in from the fjord, curling over the water and wrapping itself around the beams of the docks. Somewhere in that gray half-light a gull shrieked, not because it had found anything worth eating, but because gulls shrieked whether or not the world wanted them to. The first longship returned just after sunrise. Its sail hung slack, damp with mist, and the oars lay stacked neatly, as though the crew had wanted to prove their tidiness to no one in particular. The hull scraped against the dock, raising a sound halfway between a groan and a sigh, as if the ship itself were tired of travel. Men leapt onto the pier, splashing into the shallow water because the ship stopped just short of where it should have. They shouted instructions at one another, though none of them were listened to. Rope was thrown, missed, and thrown again. Eventually, the ship was tied in place, not elegantly, but sufficiently. A boy ran down the dock, carrying a coil of rope so tangled it looked like a nest abandoned by some oversized bird. He presented it proudly, and the older sailors studied it in silence. Then one sighed, took out a knife, and cut the coil in half. "There," he muttered, tossing one end aside. "Now we have 2 ropes, neither of which will be useful." The boy nodded as though this were an accomplishment. On shore, a dog barked at the commotion, though it had no idea why. It barked at the ship, then at the gulls, then at a barrel that rolled too close to its paws. When nothing responded, it barked again, satisfied that it had done its duty. The barrels themselves were the next problem. One rolled smoothly down the plank, landing on the dock with a thud. Another cracked open, spilling seawater onto the planks because someone had sealed it poorly. The sailor responsible shrugged and declared it a barrel of water for washing, though no one had asked for such a thing. A third barrel bounced sideways and fell into the shallows, where it bobbed cheerfully, drifting just out of reach. 2 men argued whether it was worth saving. One claimed it contained dried fish. The other insisted it was empty. By the time they agreed to pull it out, it had floated far enough that retrieving it required another boat. The gulls, meanwhile, had decided the returning ship meant breakfast. They circled low, squawking at the men, eyeing the fish nets heaped in the boat. A sailor swung his arm to scare them off, nearly hitting another man instead. The gulls did not care. They knew their time would come. Smoke began to rise from the huts at the edge of the harbor, where women had already lit fires. Tables were dragged outside, rough planks balanced on barrels, and salted fish laid out in rows. Salt clung to everything: hands, tunics, hair. By noon, the women would look as though frost had fallen on them. The fish were less cooperative. Some slid off the tables, flopping back toward the water. Children chased them, shrieking with laughter until someone shouted at them to behave. The children did not stop laughing, but they pretended to walk more slowly. One trader unrolled a bolt of wool beside his stall. Dust puffed into the air as he shook it out, and a cat leapt from inside the fabric where it had spent the night. The trader considered chasing it away, but decided against it. "It proves the cloth is warm," he said to no one in particular. No one believed him, but people gathered to touch the wool anyway, rubbing the coarse threads between their fingers. The harbor smelled of too many things at once. Tar from the ship repairs, fish from the barrels, smoke from the fires, damp wood from the piers. The mixture clung to every surface, and even the wind seemed reluctant to carry it away. A man coughed, not because the air was dangerous, but because coughing was the only response he could think of to such an assault. By mid-morning, more ships arrived. Each repeated the same ritual: ropes thrown and missed, barrels rolled and dropped, sailors shouting at one another as though volume could replace competence. A goat wandered onto the dock, nosing at the piles of seaweed scraped from the nets. When someone tried to chase it away, it leapt onto a barrel and refused to move. The sailors decided to work around it. At the far end of the pier, two old men argued about whether the tide was higher or lower than yesterday. They measured with a stick, disagreed on the markings, and then accused each other of lying. Their voices rose above the rest of the harbor noise, though no one else cared about the outcome. A fisherman sat on an overturned crate, mending a net with the patience of someone who had no interest in finishing. Every so often he paused, stared at the gulls, and muttered something rude. The gulls ignored him. The net grew no shorter. By the time the sun cleared the fog, the harbor was awake in full. The piers creaked under the weight of men and cargo. Children darted between stalls, dodging curses and the occasional swat. Cats prowled under tables, waiting for fish to fall. Dogs dozed in the shade, their earlier energy spent on pointless barking. The water slapped steadily against the pilings, marking time with a rhythm older than any ship or man. And through it all, nothing remarkable happened. No battles, no great discoveries, no songs worth remembering. Just rope, barrels, fish, gulls, children, cats, and the endless cycle of a harbor that had seen the same routine for generations. If there was glory here, it was hidden beneath the salt and the mud, too small to notice and too ordinary to care about. The breakwater was nothing more than a ridge of stones, but in the morning it spoke louder than any man. Waves struck its sides with steady patience, never rushing, never halting. Each impact was different. One slap sharp as a hand on wet cloth, another deep as a drum, another faint and trickling, as though the sea were whispering some secret no one could quite hear. Sailors swore they could tell the weather from these sounds, though they disagreed constantly about what they meant. To some, a hollow crash promised fair skies. To others, it was certain proof of a storm. The men repairing ships listened less to the arguments and more to their own tools. Mallets knocked against wooden ribs with a rhythm that tried to imitate the waves, though never in perfect time. Iron nails squeaked as they were driven into damp planks, the noise halfway between music and complaint. Tar boiled in a blackened pot over a smoky fire, bubbling and spitting like a living thing. Its smell drifted everywhere, sharp, pungent, thick enough that even the gulls veered away. The men smeared it onto seams with rags, careful at first, then careless when their patience wore thin. Their fingers turned sticky, their beards collected flecks of black. By evening, the harbor would be dotted with men who looked as though shadows had crawled across their faces. A cat wandered too close to the tar bucket. Perhaps it had been chasing a mouse. Perhaps it simply had no sense. One careless step, and its tail brushed the rim. The animal shrieked, bolted between the workmen, and left a trail of sticky prints across the dock. Children laughed, chasing after it, until the cat vanished beneath a pile of nets. Hours later, the print still shone black against the wood, a warning to any other creature tempted by curiosity. None heeded it. Voices rose and fell like the tide itself. One man shouted for a hammer, received a saw, and tried to use it anyway before realizing the mistake. Another demanded rope, was handed a coil so short it could barely tie a shoe, and cursed until he was hoarse. The curses mixed with laughter, because in the harbor no one expected competence, only persistence. Further down the pier, an older sailor sat polishing an axe. The blade had not been used in months, perhaps years, but he rubbed it with oil as though it were the key to survival. He muttered to himself, stories half remembered, none worth repeating. His audience consisted of one boy who had been told to help, but instead crouched nearby, throwing pebbles at a post. Every time one bounced back, he laughed, and the old man polished on, unbothered. The gulls returned once the tar smoke thinned. They perched along the breakwater stones, heads cocked, waiting. When a fish head was tossed aside, 3 swooped at once, colliding in midair. Their wings smacked, their cries echoed, and in the end one carried the prize away while the others screamed in indignation. A boy clapped as if it had been a performance staged for him alone. Salt drifted on the air, clinging to lips and lashes. The workers licked their mouths unconsciously, not for taste, but because the dryness demanded it. Buckets of seawater were hauled up and poured over planks to swell them, making the boards tighter. The water steamed when it met hot tar, releasing a hiss that startled newcomers, though the veterans barely noticed. To them, the hiss was part of the harbor's language, as familiar as breathing. A pair of dogs fought over a scrap of fish near the fire. They growled, circled, snapped, then lost interest simultaneously when a larger piece was dropped a few feet away. Their quarrel dissolved without decision, replaced by enthusiastic gnawing. One sailor remarked that men could learn from such efficiency, though he was ignored, as men always ignored such lessons. The rhythm of the harbor built slowly, like a song with too many verses, hammering, hissing, shouting, barking, screeching. None of it aligned, but together it became the sound of labor, imperfect yet unending. Visitors often found it overwhelming. Locals found it reassuring. If the harbor was noisy, it meant life went on. Silence would have been terrifying. Toward mid-morning, clouds began to break, and the first full light of day reached the breakwater. It illuminated every flaw, splintered boards, frayed ropes, patched sails. Yet the same light also caught the glint of wet tar, the shine of polished wood, the shimmer of water dripping from newly tightened seams. To a stranger, the ships looked half-ruined. To their crews, they looked ready. The difference was not in the wood, but in the eyes that judged it. One man sang as he worked. His voice was flat, the tune aimless, but it carried above the hammering. He sang of a voyage years past, of storms and stars and shores no one could name. Others joined in for a verse or two, then fell away. The song lingered, stubborn as smoke, even after the singer coughed and stopped. A boy tried to repeat the melody, mangled it, and declared he had invented a better one. No one argued. On the far edge of the breakwater, two men debated whether the stones had shifted. One insisted they had sunk deeper, proof the sea was winning. The other claimed they had risen, a sign the gods favored the harbor. They poked at the rocks with sticks, measuring shadows, drawing lines in the sand. Passers-by shook their heads, but the men continued. By the end of the day, they would reach no conclusion, but they would return tomorrow to argue again. The air was never still. Breezes slid along the water, carrying smells from hut to hut, from stall to stall. Sometimes they brought the sweetness of drying nets, sometimes the sting of fresh tar, sometimes the sourness of fish left too long in the sun. Each gust changed the mood of the pier, as though the harbor itself could not decide what it wished to be. Children found a barrel lid and rolled it along the planks until it crashed into a post. The impact startled a dozing sailor who shouted, tripped, and dropped his hammer into the water. There was a splash, a pause, and then the sailor declared the sea could keep it. He fetched another tool and carried on. The children tried again, but this time the lid bounced into the tar fire, sending sparks upward. Everyone shouted until the lid was dragged out. The children were scolded, laughed anyway, and vanished into the crowd. By noon, the breakwater looked much as it had at dawn: stones, waves, ships, men. Yet within those hours, the harbor had spoken in countless voices, some human, some animal, some belonging only to the sea. Nothing extraordinary had occurred. No ship was lost, no storm arrived, no treasure was found. And yet the workers would remember the tar on their fingers, the gulls on the stones, the hiss of water on hot planks. Small details clung to them, stubborn as salt. A boy was sent along the pier to count knots in the mooring lines. He did so with great seriousness, mouthing the names he had been taught: reef knot, clove hitch, something that might have been a granny by accident. When he found a tangle he could not identify, he simply declared it secure and moved on, which, in most harbors, is how things are kept together. Near the tar fire, a plank was being coaxed back to usefulness. Two men poured seawater across it in slow ladles, then waited while the wood swelled. They spoke of nothing in particular: last year's catch, a cousin who might or might not return, the price of salt that always rose when no one was looking. Each time they tested the seam with a fingertip, the plank said almost, and they nodded as if almost were a promise. An old woman set a basket on an overturned bucket and sold needles one by one, each wrapped in a twist of wool. She claimed they would not rust if kept in bread. Someone asked whether the bread would last. She said it would last long enough. A cat drifted past, tail still sticky with tar, and pretended not to hear the laughter. Farther out, a man with a small knife carved a mark into the end of an oar. Nothing grand, just a shallow cut shaped like a crooked star. He said it helped him tell his oar from the others, though all the oars were nearly identical. The little star took the light and held it as if it mattered. A gull landed so close to the breakwater that spray touched its feet. It lifted one leg, then the other, indignant at the sea for being wet. The children applauded this discovery. The sea did not apologize. The breakwater kept speaking. It would speak tomorrow and the next day, and long after the men and their ships were forgotten. For the harbor did not measure time in voyages or markets or even lives. It measured time in the endless repetition of sound, the slap of waves, the hammer on wood, the hiss of steam, the cry of birds. To those who listened, it was noise. To the sea, it was history. The market never began all at once. It drifted awake like an old man who had no reason to hurry. One stall lifted its canvas flap early, another left it tied down until the sun was high. Voices rose in fragments, never in chorus. The harbor had already been noisy with repairs and gulls, but the market added a new register, the sound of people trying to sound more important than they were. The first to arrive was a man with fish. He carried them in a basket still dripping from the sea, scales glittering like coins. He arranged them on a plank balanced between two barrels, head to tail to head, as though symmetry would make them fresher. His neighbor said the arrangement was foolish, but did the same a moment later. Soon 3 stalls displayed identical rows, each claiming to be unique. The gulls noticed first, diving to inspect, and had to be beaten back with sticks. Next came the women with wool. They unrolled their bundles onto rough tables, shaking out the fabric with the solemnity of priests displaying relics. Dust rose, drifting through the sunbeams, and one bundle released not only dust but a sleeping cat. The animal stretched, yawned, and walked off without thanks. The women pretended they had meant for this to happen, that it proved the warmth of their cloth. Customers nodded, unconvinced but entertained. A man selling pottery arrived late, carrying jars that clinked with every step. He complained loudly that the pier was too uneven, that the stones were cursed, that no one cared about honest craftsmanship. He set down his jars, one immediately cracked, and he swore this proved his point. His wife told him it proved he had carried them badly. They argued until a child pointed out that the crack made a whistling sound when the wind passed, and suddenly the jar became special. It was priced higher than the others. Salt was everywhere. A trader poured it from a sack into small clay bowls, letting it mound like white hills. His fingers glittered as he scooped, and he claimed the salt came from distant shores where the sea was bluer, the air cleaner. In truth, it had been boiled down only a few miles away, but no one said so. Customers touched it, licked it, nodded gravely, and paid whatever he asked. Children roamed between stalls, fingers sticky from fish, eyes bright with curiosity. They touched cloth, poked jars, stole handfuls of salt, and ran laughing when chased. One boy tripped on a coil of rope and sprawled across a table of onions. The onions scattered, rolling into every corner. A woman shrieked, slapped his ear, then picked up the onions one by one, brushing them off as though the dirt improved their flavor. She returned them to the basket and declared them unsold, which meant they would cost more tomorrow. Dogs wandered through the market as if they owned it. They sniffed baskets, licked scraps, lifted legs against the corners of tables. Some traders shooed them away, others ignored them. A few bribed them with bones in the hope they would guard the stall. The dogs accepted all arrangements with equal indifference. By mid-morning, the full orchestra of bargaining had begun. Voices rose and overlapped, each claiming a price too high, each pretending to believe it fair. Buyers sighed dramatically, sellers groaned in despair, and both sides repeated the ritual until meeting somewhere in the middle. Neither admitted satisfaction. That was not the way of markets. One man tried to sell a comb carved from bone. He insisted it had belonged to a hero, that the notches held the power of victory. The comb had only 12 teeth, 6 broken, but he waved it like a relic. A woman asked whether it removed lice. He admitted it did. She bought it immediately. A different stall displayed herbs tied in bundles. The vendor whispered promises of healing, of sleep, of strength. The herbs smelled mostly of damp grass, but the whispers were strong enough. A sailor bought a bundle, tucked it into his shirt, and walked taller, as though already transformed. His companions laughed, but envied him anyway. Some stalls never seemed to sell anything. A man with a pile of shells claimed each was rare, though the shore outside the harbor was littered with the same shapes. He arranged them carefully, polished them with spit, and declared them treasures. Children took them when he was not looking, and he claimed this proved their value. The crowd thickened as the sun rose. Farmers brought vegetables, sailors brought trinkets from other coasts, hunters laid down skins still stiff with salt. The air grew heavier with scents: fish, smoke, tar, sweat, wool, onions, salt, herbs. To some, it was unbearable. To others, it was the smell of profit. A commotion broke out when a goat wandered into a stall of dried apples. It chewed calmly, ignoring shouts and sticks. When someone pulled its horns, it dragged the man halfway down the pier. Laughter followed them until the goat broke free and returned to the apples. At last the stall owner surrendered, counted the half-eaten fruit, and added the cost to tomorrow's prices. Every stall claimed to offer what no one else could. Every customer claimed to be cheated. Every argument ended in a sale. This was the rhythm of the market, as unchanging as the tide. By noon, the stalls were crowded, the aisles clogged, and the sound of bargaining rose above the hammering of shipwrights and the cries of gulls. A man selling shoes tried to arrange them in neat pairs on a blanket, but the blanket sagged between the planks of the pier and the shoes rolled into heaps that no longer matched. He picked them up, studied them as if uncertain which foot they belonged to, then placed them back in new pairs. Customers pointed out that some were left shoes matched with left shoes. He shrugged and said it made no difference. The leather would soften in time. A boy tried one on backward, declared it comfortable, and ran off before paying. The vendor sighed, rearranged the heap again, and called it a display. Nearby, a woman sold combs carved from antler, each one slightly different. Each one declared superior to all the others. She ran her fingers through her own hair as demonstration, pulling out more tangles than she smoothed. She insisted this proved the combs were powerful, because only strong combs revealed true knots. A passerby laughed, bought one, and promptly snapped a tooth off it. The vendor said the breakage released hidden luck and charged him double. In another corner, a man displayed 3 buckets of eels. They writhed and slithered, splashing water onto the boards. He claimed they were tame, suitable as pets, excellent as guardians against rats. To prove this, he lifted one in his hands. The eel twisted, slapped him in the face, and fell back into the bucket with a splash. The crowd applauded. He bowed as though it had been intentional, then announced the price had risen. 2 traders argued over who had the right to sell honey. One claimed his bees lived near wildflowers, the other near clover. Each insisted that only his bees drank from the purest blossoms. A child asked whether bees could read signs that told them which flower was better. Both men shouted yes, though neither convinced the other. In the end, they stood side by side, each lowering his price by the same amount, so that customers simply bought from both. At the far end of the row, a man sat cross-legged with nothing but a pile of smooth stones. He called them charms, good for health, love, and fortune. He arranged them in circles, then squares, then triangles, each time announcing the pattern carried new power. When asked what the power was, he answered that the stones were still deciding. People gave him coins anyway, more for the performance than the stones. Children copied his patterns with pebbles, convinced they too were selling charms. The noise thickened until it seemed the air itself was bargaining. Voices overlapped, shouting, laughing, swearing, promising, denying. Every price was too high, every product too common, every stall essential, every stall ridiculous. Yet the market thrived on this contradiction. It was not meant to be efficient, only alive. And yet, for all the noise, nothing remarkable happened. No fortunes were made, no treasures discovered, no miracles performed. Only cloth unrolled, fish displayed, jars cracked, salt licked, onions scattered, goats chewing. A stranger might have called it chaos. The locals called it mourning. If the harbor was noisy with men and animals, it was twice as noisy once the children decided it belonged to them. They did not wait for permission. They never did. As soon as the market was open and the fish laid out, they appeared in packs, barefoot, wide-eyed, louder than gulls and harder to chase away. No one knew where they came from. They seemed to pour from alleys, from huts, from beneath boats. Some said the sea itself spat them out with each tide. The docks became their playground. Ropes became ladders. Barrels became mountains. Nets became traps to catch each other. They tied knots no one could untie, and then argued about whose knot was best. One boy claimed his knot was indestructible. It came loose in a gust of wind. He insisted this proved it was clever, because it knew when to release. Another girl made a knot so tangled that even the sailors surrendered. The rope was cut in half, and both halves declared cursed. They ran along the planks with no regard for sailors carrying loads twice their weight. More than one man stumbled because a child darted under his arm. The men shouted, but the children treated shouts as encouragement. One fell into a basket of herring, climbed out gleaming with scales, and declared himself a sea god. His friends bowed until a woman boxed his ears. He kept the scales anyway, glittering like a poorly made statue. At the edge of the harbor, a group of boys found a cartwheel. They rolled it along the pier, squealing with delight each time it bounced. The wheel veered, struck a post, and flew into the water. The boys stared at the ripples for a moment, then began searching for another wheel. They found a lid instead, rolled it, and crashed it into a stall of onions. The onions scattered everywhere, again, as though the harbor itself demanded onions be spilled daily. Some children preferred mischief over games. A pair of girls crept behind a fishmonger's stall and switched the price tags, raising the cheapest fish to the highest cost. When the vendor discovered the trick, he assumed the error was his own, sighed, and kept the prices as they were. Customers bought the fish anyway. The girls watched, giggling so hard they nearly fell into the salt barrels. Others chased animals. Dogs were pestered until they fled. Goats were climbed like mountains until they bucked. A goose, unwise enough to wander near, became the center of a parade, carried aloft by squealing children until it escaped and left scratches on half the group. They displayed the wounds proudly, boasting that the goose had been fiercer than any wolf. The bravest of the children clambered onto the unfinished ships. They balanced along the beams, pretending to be captains, shouting orders no one followed. Some waved sticks as swords. Others declared themselves kings of the harbor, only to be dethroned moments later. The shipwrights tried to chase them down, but gave up quickly, muttering that no one could build while the sea kept sending them apprentices too small to work. Noise was constant, shrieks of laughter, sudden cries of pain, arguments over pebbles. They echoed from one end of the market to the other. Adults tried to continue their business, but every bargain was punctuated by a child's shriek or giggle. Some traders swore the noise attracted customers. Others swore it drove them away. Both kept selling. A group of boys found a length of rope and decided to measure the harbor. They stretched it across the pier, daring anyone to step over without paying a toll. Most sailors grumbled, lifted the rope, and kept walking. One tripped, cursed, and gave them a coin to stop. They spent it on dried apples, which they ate while arguing who had invented the toll first. By the end, none remembered, but all agreed they had been cheated. Girls gathered near the wool stalls, plaiting scraps into braids. They tied them around their heads like crowns, parading proudly. A woman tried to shoo them away, but they declared themselves queens and ignored her. One crown unraveled in the wind, scattering wool into the water. The gulls swooped, thinking it food, and flew off with strands of wool in their beaks. The girls claimed the gulls were their servants, spreading their banners across the sky. Occasionally, a child fell into the water. This caused no alarm. A shout went up, a rope was thrown, the child hauled out dripping, and life went on. The wet one shivered for a while, then returned to running, smelling now of seaweed and mud. By evening, at least 3 would have fallen, and each would insist they had meant to. One boy carried a stick taller than himself and used it to prod everything he passed. Barrels, baskets, people, animals. When told to stop, he declared the stick a weapon against sea monsters. A sailor asked what monsters lived in the harbor. The boy pointed at the gulls. The sailor admitted the boy might be right. Amid the chaos, some children worked, though work was indistinguishable from play. A girl carried water from the shore, spilling half of it as she skipped. A boy mended nets badly, tangling them worse than before. Another ran errands, forgetting what he had been sent for but returning with something else useful. Adults sighed, paid them with scraps of bread, and called it good enough. By late morning the children were tired, though they would never admit it. They sprawled in the shade of boats, chewing stolen fruit, arguing about which game had been best. Some declared it was chasing the goose. Others insisted it was climbing the half-built ship. One boy said it was falling in the fish basket. He still smelled like herring. The argument lasted until they all fell asleep, mouths sticky, hands dirty, faces painted with dust. Not every child chose to run. A few preferred sitting at the very edge of the dock, legs dangling above the water, dropping stones to see how far the ripples spread. They competed silently, watching circles overlap until one boy swore his stone had frightened a fish. The others leaned over to see, nearly toppling into the sea. An old woman shouted at them to move before they drowned. They shifted exactly 1 plank farther and continued. Some children invented trades of their own. A pair of brothers gathered driftwood and announced they were selling it as firewood. Their pile grew quickly, but their prices grew faster. They charged coins, then shells, then promises. Customers gave them nothing, but the boys still declared the business a success. Another girl set up a tavern made of overturned baskets, pouring seawater into broken cups and demanding payment in onion skins. Her patrons drank solemnly, nodded approval, and spat it out as soon as she turned away. A group of older boys attempted theater. They stole rags from stalls, wrapped themselves in makeshift cloaks, and declared themselves kings, raiders, and gods. Their stage was the stern of a half-finished boat. They shouted speeches that echoed down the pier, half threats and half nonsense. The audience, mostly younger children, booed or cheered according to whim. A cat wandered across the stage, and the actors chased it, forgetting their lines. The audience clapped anyway. Not all their inventions were harmless. One clever girl discovered that dried fish tails could be tied to dogs. She demonstrated with enthusiasm, and soon half a dozen animals were running in circles, pursued by their own prizes. The children laughed until their sides ached, while the dogs overturned baskets and barrels in their panic. When the tails finally tore loose, the dogs carried them triumphantly into the crowd, as though they had hunted the fish themselves. Adults cleaned the mess for hours. Occasionally, a child grew serious. A boy sat beside a sailor and asked how knots worked, repeating every explanation with new questions. Why this rope? Why this twist? Why this pattern? The sailor answered patiently until he ran out of words. The boy tied the knot backward and declared it better. Another girl watched the shipwrights hammering planks and imitated every swing with a stick. She hit nothing of use, dented the dock, and declared she was building her own ship. No one doubted she believed it. By late morning, the harbor looked as though children had been born from the sea itself. They were everywhere, hanging from ropes, shouting from rooftops, sleeping in piles under carts. The air carried their voices like wind carries gulls, endlessly circling, never landing. To an outsider, it might have seemed unbearable. To those who lived there, it was simply part of the harbor's song. And so the harbor returned to the rhythm of adults, the hammering, the bargaining, the endless cries of gulls. But even as they slept, the children were part of it, as necessary as rope, as noisy as dogs, as stubborn as salt. Tomorrow, they would rise again with the tide, pouring back into the docks, scattering onions, chasing goats, measuring the harbor with rope, shouting themselves hoarse. No one wanted them there. No one could imagine the harbor without them. By midday, the harbor seemed to have doubled in size. The same planks, the same piers, the same crooked stalls. All of it looked larger, louder, and heavier, simply because every man, woman, child, dog, goat, and gull had decided to move at once. The sun stood high, spilling heat across wood and stone, and the air thickened with the smells of salt, smoke, sweat, and fish that had already been on display too long. The fishmongers worked fastest. Rows of herring and cod dried under the sun, while others were salted at long tables. The women leaned over the boards, tossing handfuls of white crystals across glistening bodies, rubbing it into scales until their arms sparkled. Salt clung to their fingers, their sleeves, their hair, as though they were slowly turning into statues. Some fish accepted their fate, others slid free, flopping into the dust where children pounced on them, shouting triumphantly. The children were scolded, but the fish still found their way back into baskets, brushed off as though sand were seasoning. Barrels rolled endlessly, thudding against one another, bouncing into corners, wobbling along planks. Some were pushed too quickly and toppled, spilling brine that seeped into every crack of the dock. Men shouted at boys to help, boys shouted at dogs to move, dogs barked at gulls, gulls screamed at everyone. A goat climbed onto a barrel and refused to step down even when the barrel was rolled halfway across the pier. It rode calmly, chewing an onion leaf. Traders competed for space. Cloth sellers unrolled wool in every direction, letting it billow in the sea breeze. The colors were dull, grays, browns, faded reds, but they were shaken out with such ceremony that one might have thought they were royal banners. A man selling pottery shouted louder, insisting that jars mattered more than cloth. His neighbor banged on a copper pan until the noise forced customers his way. The argument spread down the row: wool against clay, clay against metal, metal against fish. In the end, customers bought a little of everything, because that was easier than listening to the shouting. Salt traders grew busier as the sun climbed. Bowls of white crystals gleamed like snowdrifts in the heat. People licked their fingers, dipped them, tasted, and nodded gravely as though each grain carried wisdom. The traders charged more by the minute. A boy dropped his coin into a bowl by accident, declared it payment, and walked away with both salt and coin. The trader stared, then told the next customer the coin was blessed, and raised the price again. At the edge of the harbor, shipwrights hammered faster, sweat dripping from their brows. Every blow echoed, mingling with the cries of vendors and children. The heat softened the tar until it smelled stronger than before, coating the air like smoke. Men wiped their hands on their tunics, leaving dark streaks that never faded. One sat down heavily, swore he would work again after a rest, and promptly fell asleep sitting upright. Others stepped around him as though he were a barrel. Dogs darted through the crowd, tongues lolling, chasing scraps. They knocked into stalls, stole bread, chewed rope. A pair of them found a basket of dried fish tails and dragged it into the street. Children gave chase, laughing and shrieking, until both dogs and children disappeared behind a hut. A moment later, the basket returned empty, carried proudly by a boy who announced the dogs had paid him in loyalty. No one questioned it. The noise of bargaining swelled until it was impossible to tell who shouted what. A woman declared her onions the sweetest. A man claimed his knives the sharpest. Another swore his honey the purest. Customers repeated the same sighs, groans, and arguments. Coins clinked, shells changed hands, promises were made and forgotten. The entire harbor became a theater of pretense where everyone acted cheated, and everyone kept buying anyway. Heat drove some to shade, but shade was scarce. People crowded under canopies that sagged with the weight of cloth and dust. Others huddled behind barrels, pressed against walls, or simply covered their heads with baskets. The sun showed no mercy. It gleamed on armor, blinded eyes, burned necks, and turned the harbor into an oven where fish baked in their own smell. By early afternoon, tempers shortened. A sailor dropped a jar, and it shattered. He blamed the stones, the jar maker, the gods. The jar maker blamed the sailor. The gods were silent. A woman argued with a trader about the size of a loaf. She measured it against her fist, declared it too small, and demanded another. The trader produced the same loaf, turned it sideways, and insisted it looked larger that way. She paid anyway. The gulls screamed above it all, their cries sharper now, more desperate. They fought over scraps, dove at tables, stole whatever glistened. One snatched a fish head from a basket and dropped it onto a man's shoulder. The man shouted, the gull screamed, the crowd laughed. Another gull landed boldly on a table of bread and tore at the crust until chased away. The bread sold faster after that because customers claimed the gull had chosen it as the best. Children, still restless, invented races across the planks. They dashed between sailors carrying crates, dodged angry shouts, and collapsed in heaps of laughter. One boy tripped, rolled into a pile of wool, and emerged looking like a sheep. His friends declared him the new mascot of the market. Traders told him to leave. He refused until bribed with an apple. Somewhere between the stalls and the shipwrights, a man balanced a tray of wooden cups filled with watered ale. He announced loudly that it was refreshing, restorative, essential in the heat. Half the cups sloshed empty before reaching customers, and the other half tasted more of water than ale. Still, people drank. They complained, of course, too weak, too warm, too small. But they paid, and the vendor promised that tomorrow he would bring stronger drink. Tomorrow, he always said, though tomorrow never changed. Two boys discovered a pile of oyster shells discarded beside a hut. They arranged them in patterns, first circles, then spirals, then a shape they swore was a dragon. Passers-by glanced down, puzzled, then hurried on. The boys insisted the dragon was guarding the harbor, and when a gull landed too near, they declared the gull defeated. The gull squawked and flew away, which only proved their point. They bowed solemnly, then ruined the pattern themselves by chasing each other through it. A trader with a cart of turnips shouted so loudly that people came just to see if he was hurt. He wasn't. He simply liked to shout. His turnips were no larger than anyone else's, no sweeter, no cheaper, but his voice carried above the crowd like a horn. By the end of the hour, he had sold them all, mostly to people who wanted him to stop shouting. At the edge of the market, two women argued over fabric. One swore her cloth was woven from wool of sheep that grazed on hills kissed by morning dew. The other said hers was stronger because her sheep ate roots pulled straight from the earth. They repeated these lines so often that even they seemed to forget whether dew or roots were better. Customers bought both, not because they believed the claims, but because they were too entertained to leave without paying. Meanwhile, a donkey stood tied to a post, flicking its tail. Children decorated its mane with bits of string and onion skins until it looked almost festive. The owner returned, groaned, and declared the donkey cursed. The children laughed, and the donkey, indifferent, continued flicking its tail as though none of it mattered. Two sailors began an arm wrestling contest at a table meant for onions. Their arms strained, the table creaked, onions rolled off the edge. A small crowd gathered, cheering one, then the other. The contest ended when the table collapsed and both men toppled into the dust. The onions were bruised, the sailors laughed, the crowd dispersed. The stall owner demanded compensation, which he never received. He picked up the onions, brushed off the dirt, and doubled the price. The sun pressed down harder, and people moved slower, but the noise never lessened. Children still shrieked, dogs still barked, gulls still screamed. Bargains dragged on, hands waved in exasperation, coins clinked reluctantly. No one left satisfied, but no one left empty-handed either. That was the harbor's law. Everywhere was motion, noise, heat. The harbor at midday was less a place than a storm, noisy, crowded, exhausting. Yet beneath the chaos, trade continued, ships were repaired, meals prepared. It was not efficient, nor peaceful, nor pleasant. But it was life, and life did not pause for anyone. The afternoon crept into the harbor without ceremony, yet everyone felt its weight. The sun no longer rose but pressed downward, flattening shadows and bending backs. Heat clung to planks, to ropes, to shoulders slick with sweat. The morning's energy gave way to a slower rhythm, as though the harbor had aged several years since dawn. Even the gulls screamed less often, content to sit on rooftops, wings spread lazily, waiting for the next accident. The first sign of visitors came not from sails on the horizon, but from the smell. Salt and tar had been the constant perfumes of the day, but now there was something new. Spice, faint but insistent, carried on the shifting wind. Some swore it was cinnamon, others claimed it was pepper. A boy insisted it smelled like burning bread. Whatever it was, it pulled noses upward, made traders squint toward the fjord. By the time the first ship appeared, half the market was already craning its neck. The vessel was smaller than the longships moored earlier, but its hull was wide, built for carrying goods rather than warriors. Its sail hung limp in the afternoon stillness, painted with a pattern no one here recognized. That was enough to spark rumor. "Frisians," one man said. "Too small." "Surely Danes," said another. A third declared they were simply lost fishermen who had stolen the wrong boat. The ship scraped against the dock, raising the familiar groan of wood against wood. Ropes were thrown, missed, thrown again, and eventually tied with the same inefficiency as every other arrival. Men clambered out, blinking at the noise, the smells, the children who had already gathered like gulls circling new bait. The strangers looked unimpressed. Travel had bleached their clothes with salt and sun. Their beards were stiff, their hair tangled, their boots crusted with mud from places no one here had seen. They carried crates between them, heavy enough to bend knees. A curious crowd gathered before they had set down the first load. Rumors spread faster than goods. Someone whispered that the crates held silver. Another swore it was wine. A boy shouted it must be weapons. The truth was less dramatic. Dried fruit, coarse cloth, sacks of grain. Still, each item was examined as though it had fallen from the sky. Traders pressed forward, offering coins, shells, promises. Bargains broke out before the crates were even opened. The visitors looked bewildered at first, then amused. One lifted a fig from a sack, bit into it, and handed the rest to a child who stared wide-eyed, unsure whether to eat or worship it. The crowd gasped, as though generosity itself had arrived on the tide. Within moments, the figs were worth twice their original value. Not all went smoothly. One crate slipped from a sailor's grip, crashed onto the dock, and burst open. Grain spilled across the planks, a river of yellow scattering between the boards. Children screamed with delight, scooping it up in handfuls, tossing it into the air as though it were treasure. Dogs darted in, licking and scattering more. The visiting sailors shouted, the locals shouted back, and in the end, no one knew whose grain was whose. By evening, much of it would still be wedged between the cracks, feeding rats and gulls. Another group of strangers brought jars of oil. They smelled sharp, carried carefully, and stacked in a neat pyramid beside the stall of onions. The local potter eyed the jars with envy, declaring loudly that foreign clay was weak, prone to cracking. He struck one with his knuckle to prove the point. It did not crack. Instead, it sang faintly, as if laughing at him. The crowd laughed too, and the potter sulked the rest of the afternoon. Children hovered closest, of course. They touched everything, asked endless questions, and offered trades no one accepted. A boy tried to exchange a dead crab for a strip of cloth. A girl offered a goose feather for a handful of raisins. The strangers smiled politely, nodded gravely, and handed them scraps anyway. The children ran off, shrieking triumph, convinced they had won. The heat grew heavier. Traders fanned themselves with lids. Dogs sprawled in the shade of crates. Cats disappeared altogether. Voices slowed but did not quiet. Bargains dragged longer, each pause filled with sweat dripping from foreheads. The visitors tried to remain patient, but their faces grew red, their voices rough. One sneezed into a sack of flour, covering his beard in white. The crowd howled with laughter, insisting the flour was now blessed. It sold quickly. By mid-afternoon, more ships arrived. Some carried nothing but salted meat, others tools, others passengers too weary to care. Each arrival was greeted with the same ritual: ropes thrown and missed, crates dropped, rumors invented. With every new sail, the harbor swelled until it seemed ready to burst. Not all welcomed the crowd. The goats grew restless, bleating as people pressed too close. One clambered onto a crate of pottery, nearly toppling the whole stack. Another chased a child carrying figs, headbutting him until the fruit scattered. The child cried, the goat ate, the crowd laughed. Dogs barked furiously, but no one stopped them. The shipwrights tried to continue their repairs, but children climbed onto unfinished beams to watch the arrivals. Sawdust mixed with grain, tar dripped onto cloth. Arguments broke out over space. A sailor swore someone had stolen his knife. Hours later, it was found under a barrel, where it had fallen unnoticed. By then, he had accused half the market of theft. Stories sprouted as quickly as weeds. One man swore the newcomers carried letters from kings. Another claimed they brought curses. A third insisted they were spies. No one knew, and no one cared. The crates themselves were evidence enough of importance. People crowded, bought, sold, bartered, lied. The visitors learned quickly. The louder they shouted, the more they sold. Soon they were shouting as loudly as the locals, indistinguishable except for the odd words that slipped through their accents. The harbor became a festival of confusion. Fishmongers fought for space beside cloth traders. Goats wrestled over onions. Gulls stole figs. Children ran carrying scraps of foreign cloth like flags. The heat pressed harder. The noise thickened. The smells layered until no one could separate them. If morning had been busy, afternoon was madness. Not every arrival brought excitement. One ship carried nothing but empty barrels, rattling like bones when they rolled onto the pier. The sailors explained again and again that barrels were useful, that they could hold anything, that the future itself would be poured into them. The crowd listened politely and then wandered away. Barrels were common enough. The sailors shrugged, stacked them anyway, and pretended to be satisfied. By evening, a few would be sold, not because anyone needed them, but because someone always pitied the man who shouted longest. Another ship carried passengers rather than goods. They stepped onto the dock, blinking against the light, clutching small bundles of belongings. Their clothes marked them as travelers from somewhere inland. Wool tunics heavy for the heat, shoes stiff with dust, faces pale from lack of sea air. They looked lost before anyone had spoken to them. Children swarmed, tugging at sleeves, asking questions no one could answer quickly. The travelers nodded, bewildered, and allowed themselves to be led toward the market where prices were already rising at the sight of their coins. One woman dropped a bundle, scattering apples across the pier. Gulls dove immediately, children too, and for a moment the dock was a storm of wings and hands. By the time the apples were gathered, half were pecked, half bruised, and one missing entirely. The woman sighed, picked up what was left, and continued. The gull flew off proudly with its prize, dropping bits of apple as it went. Nearby, two strangers argued in a language no one understood. Their gestures were wild, their voices sharp, and the crowd drew close in curiosity. After several minutes of incomprehensible shouting, one pulled from his pouch a necklace of shells, the other produced a pouch of salt, and they exchanged the two without further noise. The crowd groaned, disappointed at the lack of drama, and dispersed. At the far edge of the pier, musicians appeared, if the word could be used generously. One banged a drum with such enthusiasm that the rhythm vanished. Another blew into a horn until his cheeks swelled purple. A third strummed a harp with only 3 strings, claiming fewer strings meant purer notes. The sound was dreadful, but children danced, sailors clapped, and traders declared it festive. Coins clinked into a bowl, and the musicians grinned, proving that noise, however ugly, had value. The longer the afternoon stretched, the slower time seemed to pass. Shadows shortened, then lengthened again, but the heat remained heavy. People wiped brows, shifted weight, muttered curses, argued over trifles. A man complained that the sun was brighter than yesterday, though no one could measure such a thing. Another insisted the harbor planks were hotter underfoot, though all planks were equally hot. Still, the arguments passed the time, which was all they were meant to do. Even animals slowed. Dogs lay panting in the dust, ignoring scraps. Goats chewed lazily, tails swishing half-heartedly. Only the gulls refused to rest, still diving at stalls, still screaming, still insisting the harbor was theirs. Their cries rang sharp over the voices of men, cutting the afternoon into pieces. Yet through the chaos, trade continued. Coins changed hands, jars emptied, sacks lightened. No one was satisfied, but no one left empty-handed. The harbor was never about satisfaction. It was about survival, and survival was noisy, sweaty, clumsy, and endless. If the morning had been busy and the afternoon crowded, then the late afternoon belonged entirely to the merchants and their voices. Nothing in the harbor was louder than men and women who believed their onions, their wool, their jars, or their knives were worth more than anyone else's. The tinkering of hammers faded, the shouts of children softened, even the gulls paused between screams. What remained was the long, droning music of bargaining, an endless, repetitive chant that could make a listener both drowsy and irritated at once. It began with onions. It always began with onions. A farmer laid them out in neat rows, bulbs glowing gold in the sun. He named a price so high that no one could possibly pay it. Customers groaned, clutched their purses, shook their heads. He groaned louder, clutched his heart, shook his head back. A woman offered half. He refused. She added a little more. He sighed, and they agreed at exactly the price he had wanted all along. The next customer watched the whole ritual, knew it was a ritual, and repeated it anyway. By the third sale, everyone was tired, but the onions kept changing hands. Nearby, a wool trader unfolded a bolt of fabric so slowly that time itself seemed to stretch. He stroked it, shook it, held it to the light, and described how it had been woven by women on hillsides kissed by dew. Another trader scoffed, insisting his own wool came from sheep that had eaten salt grass, which made their fleece stronger. Customers touched both, nodded gravely, and began the same chant. Too dear, too heavy, too thin, too coarse. Coins eventually moved, though no one looked happy. The pottery seller had jars stacked in towers, each slightly crooked, each threatening to topple. He shouted that his jars were sturdy, even as one cracked in the heat. He swore it was the fault of the dock, not the jar. A customer tapped another with his knuckle, listened to the ring, and shook his head. The seller insisted the ring meant quality. The customer insisted it meant weakness. They argued for 10 minutes before settling at a price both had secretly chosen from the beginning. The cracked jar was sold too, called decorative instead of broken. Metalworkers clanged knives together to prove sharpness. One sliced a piece of rope in demonstration, then discovered the rope was already frayed. He claimed the knife had cut it twice. Another banged a pan until the sound made children cover their ears. He declared the echo was proof of divine blessing. Coins moved. Pans changed hands. The ringing continued until someone threatened to throw the pan into the sea. The seller claimed it would still ring underwater, and the argument began again. Salt traders measured their goods with shells, scooping carefully, spilling deliberately. Each grain was described as rare, as sacred, as stronger than any other salt. A woman licked her finger, dipped it, and declared it ordinary. The trader swore she had no taste. She swore he had no honesty. They both raised their voices until the crowd gathered, laughing, and finally paid more than the original price just for the entertainment. Even trinkets became essential. A man selling combs from antlers shouted they could drive out lice and evil spirits alike. A woman asked which was harder to remove. He answered spirits without hesitation. She bought 3. Another man with shells claimed they were charms for fortune. Children pocketed them for free, and he shouted this proved their value. He sold the empty table to a passerby who wanted wood. All through the market, voices wove together like ropes tangled in the tide. Every price was too high, every offer too low, every sigh rehearsed, every groan performed. To outsiders, it looked like conflict. To locals, it was simply the harbor's other language. But the heat wore on. Bargains dragged longer, tempers grew shorter. A man argued over a fish until it spoiled in the sun. Another haggled for wool until the bolt unraveled, threads trailing into the dust. Still they argued, because the point was not to own fish or cloth, but to prove one had not been fooled. A child watched a woman and a trader debate over onions for nearly an hour. At the end, she paid nearly the same as the first price. The child asked why she had wasted so much time. She answered, "Because now I know he respects me." The trader answered, "Because now she knows I respect her." Both walked away unsatisfied, but satisfied enough. Dogs barked at the noise, goats butted into stalls, gulls screeched overhead, but none of it interrupted the bargains. The harbor was swallowed in the rhythm of words, the endless seesaw of demand and refusal. Some customers forgot what they had come to buy. Some traders forgot what they had meant to sell. Yet the dance continued, as eternal as the tide. By the time the sun dipped lower, the arguments had become slower, heavier, but no quieter. One could walk the length of the market and hear the same words repeated at every stall. Too much, too little, too fine, too poor, I cannot, you must, I swear, I refuse. Each syllable carried the weight of centuries, though it changed nothing. And through it all, coins clinked, goods changed hands, and no one admitted satisfaction. That was never the purpose. The harbor lived not on peace, nor on justice, nor even on profit, but on the endless performance of bargaining. It was noise pretending to be necessity, frustration pretending to be progress, theater pretending to be survival. By dusk, the voices would fade, the stalls would close, the traders would sleep. But tomorrow, the ritual would begin again, exactly the same, as though no one remembered the day before. The bargains were not meant to be concluded. They were meant to be repeated forever. Evening was supposed to mean the end of things, but on the western coast, the sun did not agree. It dipped, yes, but only a little, sliding toward the sea, as if testing the idea of leaving and then changing its mind. Shadows grew long, stretching like tired men across the planks, yet never quite dissolving into darkness. The sky was neither day nor night, but something in between, a dim gold that clung to the water, making every ripple shine. The harbor did not quiet. It never truly did. Instead, it shifted into a slower, heavier rhythm. Traders announced they were closing, then opened their mouths again when someone touched a basket. "Last price!" they shouted, though each last price was higher than the one before. One man held up the same onion he had been holding since morning, insisting it was better now, warmed by the sun, seasoned by the day. Customers groaned, haggled, and paid. Closing was only another way to keep selling. Children refused to go home, if home was even real. They ran more slowly now, but they still ran. A boy crouched inside a basket and demanded to be salted like fish. His sister complied with a fistful of sand. He coughed, she laughed, and both declared themselves merchants. Another boy looped a rope around a goat and sold rides for a shell apiece. The goat bucked off every passenger, which only made the game more popular. By the end, the goat had earned nothing, the boy less than nothing, and the crowd a good deal of laughter. Dogs roamed with hopeful noses, tails dragging in fatigue. One found a crust of bread and carried it like treasure until another stole it. Their chase circled the pier, scattering jars, startling children, angering traders. Finally, the bread dropped into the sea, and both dogs stood staring at the waves as though betrayed by the ocean itself. They barked at the water, and the water ignored them. The gulls grew bold with the lingering light. They swooped down in pairs, snatching scraps and rising again with triumphant cries. One landed on a pile of wool, tearing a strip loose. The trader shouted, raised a stick, missed, and struck his own basket instead. The gull escaped. The wool flew away, and the trader claimed the gull had been a sign from the gods, proof that his cloth was too valuable for ordinary hands. He raised the price. Someone paid it. People lingered because there was no signal to leave. In the south or east, darkness sent everyone to bed. Here the sun teased, refusing to vanish, hanging low over the western sea like a coin balanced on the rim of a bowl. Its light flattened the harbor, turning every plank and rope into silhouettes. Traders sat on barrels, drinking thin ale and swearing it was strong. Sailors gnawed fishtails, declaring dusk made them tastier. Everything was tastier at dusk, if only because it meant the hardest part of the day had passed. Stories drifted through the half-light. A man claimed the strangers who had arrived carried silver under their grain sacks. Another swore the jars were cursed because gulls had touched them. A third announced the tide was higher than ever, though his measuring stick showed exactly the same mark as yesterday. It did not matter. The stories gave people something to do with their voices, and that was reason enough. Children demanded stories, too. An old woman described a sea monster large enough to swallow ships whole. She painted it with words. Scales like shields, eyes like lanterns, teeth like oars. The children shrieked and clung to her skirt. Then she admitted it had all happened before she was born, and perhaps it had only been a very big fish. The children shrieked again, this time from delight. When she nodded off mid-sentence, they decided the monster still lived, hiding just beneath the waves. Traders pretended to pack their stalls, but always left something exposed. A bolt of cloth unfolded itself again. Onions rolled out of baskets. Jars glistened in the last sunlight. No one wanted to miss the final coin of the day. Bargains continued long after they should have ended, voices echoing against the stone breakwater. Cats emerged from wherever they had been hiding from the heat. Their eyes caught the strange twilight, gleaming like coins themselves. One leapt onto a table, sniffed at dried fish, and carried it away. Another curled into a pile of wool, unmoving no matter how often the trader poked it. In the end, the man left the cat there and went home. Wool could wait. Men grew looser with their tongues. Ale warmed them. Or perhaps it was only the relief of surviving another day. One sailor sang, loud enough to make gulls pause. His friends joined, each in a different tune. The result was dreadful, but they sang harder, swaying, clapping, spilling drink. A trader tried to scold them and found himself singing too. No one knew the words, no one needed to. A boy held a stick aloft and declared himself king of the harbor. He marched along the pier, scattering children until the stick snapped. He proclaimed that the gods had stolen his crown. The others bowed anyway. Another child claimed kingship over rats, chasing dogs until the dogs barked in protest. By the end of the evening, there were half a dozen monarchs, none with real subjects, all ruling nothing but noise. Fights nearly began but collapsed under the weight of fatigue. Two men argued over the price of herring until the herring spoiled. Another shouted about dice until he fell asleep mid-accusation. A woman caught her son stealing salt, sighed, and gave him more to save trouble. Evening wore patience thin, but it rarely carried through to action. The tide swelled higher, rocking boats gently against their ropes. Sailors stumbled aboard. Women gathered baskets. Children dragged their feet in protest. Yet the light lingered. It was never quite dark, never fully day. The sky glowed in a band of orange and silver where sea met horizon. People squinted, rubbed eyes, muttered that the sun should go down, as though the sun might listen. It did not. By the time the hour was late, the harbor looked weary, but not empty. Some slept against barrels, others inside boats. Still others walked home slowly, shadows stretching across the uneven planks. Dogs curled near scraps, cats prowled among spilled grain, gulls settled on rooftops. The sound of waves against stone continued, steady, eternal. And so evening arrived, though not the kind with darkness and lamps. It arrived as a long pause, a weary sigh. A half-light stretched across the water. The harbor did not close. It leaned sideways into rest, muttering, bargaining, laughing, promising that tomorrow would be easier, though everyone knew it would not. The sun still glowed on the edge of the sea, refusing to disappear, making the harbor believe that perhaps the day was not ending at all, but simply beginning again.